Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out for our fourth and final lecture on climate change in Squamish. And tonight we're going to be looking at framings of climate change and also looking at lessons that may be taken away from COVID. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Squamish First Nations. We're very lucky and honored to be remotely gathering on this territory. I would now like to hand it over to Mayor Elliott for an introduction to tonight.
Thanks, Ian, and welcome everyone. Is there an echo? I can hear the echo.
You sound fine to me.
Okay. So tonight we'll be talking about how we frame an issue, and I think that's really important. It made me think of my experience last year. I was invited by the province to join their advisory committee on the new Environmental Assessment Act. And I was joined on, so I was one of two local government representatives. There was First Nations, industry, civil society groups, and higher education. And it was really interesting at that first meeting to realize that we were all approaching the Environmental Assessment Act from a different way of thinking about the problem. So some people saw this as a problem related to the economy. Others saw it as a problem related to sustainable communities. Others saw it as a problem related to rights and title, or the environment, or social justice. So those first few meetings were really informative as we all understood the frame in which we were seeing the legislation, we kind of had to interpret for each other, or help each other see from our perspectives. And it was a really, it was a frustrating experience at times, but also really rewarding. And it's something that I keep in mind as we make decisions at the district, that just because I see a problem one way doesn't mean the person that I'm talking to sees it that way as well. So I think the conversation tonight is really important, because I do think people see climate change from a number of different perspectives. And we have to be alive to that as we go out into the community and start talking about our climate action plan, and how we see the priorities and how others might see them differently to us. So I think this is a great closing topic. I think it was voted on last week as the leading topic of interest. So I'm looking forward to Ian's lecture tonight, and reading people's comments or hearing their questions. And I'm happy to jump in later, Ian, if there's questions for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mayor Elliott. I just want to recognize that how much work our mayor and council have done to remain engaged and connected amid COVID. I think a lot of people would use this as an excuse to work half as hard because it's so hard to gather with people and get their feedback. However, I feel like our council is working twice as hard, so it's really impressive. So as most of you are aware, my name is Ian Picketts, and I'm the Manager of Sustainability and Climate Change here at the District of Squamish. So we've gone over this a few times, so I'll keep it brief, but a few reasons why we decided to embark on a lecture series. One is that it's really fun and important to keep learning and keep sharpening the saw, so to speak, throughout time. And this is a way to get people together to learn and to communicate a little bit. Also a resource for people who are lifelong learners, and also hopefully some teachers who are faced to deliver classes in a very different way. And also purposefully have made these to be quite a challenge. Let's get together and ask some hard questions, and trying to provide resources for more information along the way, and to the extent we can, trying to create some interactive elements. So one lesson to be learned from these lectures is it's probably not the best idea to ask everyone what we should talk about next week, because you kind of have to do what they say. I had a couple other topics in mind. I believe so. Am I not? Oh, I apologize. I've just been told I might not be sharing my screen. Okay, sorry if you weren't able to see my screen there. But anyways, this is what was voted upon last week as the preferred topics of conversation. So the main one was different frames or ways to think about climate change. And we're going to get into that. I think it's a really fascinating topic. I think you picked a great one. Also, we're going to take a few minutes and talk about COVID and climate and maybe some lessons that we can learn from our experiences over the last few months. So just to review, going to talk about climate change adaptation and mitigation a little bit more. We spent a fair bit of time last week differentiating between the two and thinking about how they complement each other or can contradict each other. And then going to move into a healthy conversation about framings of climate change, ending with COVID. Okay, so just to sharpen your minds and think back to last week, little quiz question for you. So last week we went over Squamish's adaptation strategy, and in that strategy, 3 near-term priorities are identified. So these are priorities or impacts related to climate change that are defined to be necessary for us to start acting on right away. So which A, B, C, or D represents the 3 near-term priorities? Okay, so it looks like most of you voted on A. I framed this in a tricky way because I didn't put them in order. The 3 near-term priorities were identified to be extreme precipitation, forest fires, and sea level rise. Interestingly enough, river flooding was in the near-term priority initially. However, if you think back to last week, remember David Rolston related this, that there was not found to be a strong statistical correlation between river flooding and recent climate change in this region. There is strong statistical correlations in a lot of the world, particularly further north with Nival or snow-dominated rivers. Even though there was not found to be that statistical correlation, they're still planning for an up to 10% increase in peak river flooding events. Okay, so we did definitely talk about this in more detail last week. But one thing that's really important to note is that adaptation and mitigation are thought of as 2 different kind of camps or types of responses to climate change, the 2 main ones, in fact. But they're both fundamentally oriented at the same underlining goal, which is reducing climate change risks. So adaptation serves to reduce risks by responding to impacts, and mitigation serves to reduce risks by avoiding impacts. They're both driven by society's ability to change, and they both rely on the development of new technologies and ways of thinking. One thing I would really encourage you to do as we talk about the different frames is I feel that some of the different framings that I'm going to present really place themselves much more in an adaptation or a mitigation framework. So it's interesting to think about that. And you noticed I had a ... and on the other slide. So a third, much more kind of fringy response to climate change that has been entering the conversations more and more of late is geoengineering. So geoengineering can be defined as large-scale and deliberate intervention in Earth natural systems, specifically in this case, the climate systems. So this is also sometimes called climate intervention. The slide shows a couple of the major ways that we can go about doing this. So one of the major topics is solar radiation. So doing things like putting aerosols, such as sulfates, in balloons and releasing them in the upper atmosphere. Essentially what you're doing is you're preventing some of Earth's shortwave radiation from reaching the surface, some of the sun's shortwave radiation from reaching Earth, reflecting it right off the start, and so kind of lowering the energy that we are getting. There's other ways that you can manage or kind of manipulate solar radiation. So you could do things like putting light-colored blankets over ice caps. You could even put white rubber balls or plastic balls in oceans to make them more reflective. You can do things like seeding, putting different types of aerosols in the atmosphere to facilitate more cloud formation. So all sorts of different things. Another one is iron fertilization, which is shown in the right. So basically, you're putting things into the ocean to facilitate more phytoplankton growth. It can also be a little bit tricky to draw a line between mitigation and geoengineering, and it's not totally understood where that line lies. So for example, if you reforest an area, that would be considered mitigation because you're enhancing Earth's natural ability to sequester carbon. If you're planting a specific type of tree that uptakes more CO2, probably that would be considered mitigation. However, if you're planting a genetically modified tree that grows faster and uptakes CO2 more quickly, that could be considered kind of in that gray area between mitigation and geoengineering. Lots of disagreement about geoengineering. Some people are probably and acceptably upset that I'm even talking about it. Some people say that even the mention of it implies this, this human false sense that we can engineer our way out of anything. One thing that I will be very clear about is even proponents of geoengineering admit that it can only happen alongside substantial mitigation. It is very risky. A good way to think about climate change, it's like a really, really bad experiment. The reason it's such a bad experiment is n equals 1. You really want to control when you do an experiment. There's no control planet. So if we had a couple of Earths to mess around with, it'd be a lot less worrisome. And of course, when you engage in something like geoengineering, you're very liable to encounter side effects that we didn't expect. Just like the people from England who thought that putting rabbits in Australia would give people a taste of home and it would be fun to hunt, they really didn't think that one through, and there were a huge amount of cascading effects to that continent that we're still seeing today. So moving on to framing climate change, you could argue that there's infinite ways to package the challenge and think about it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 6 frames of climate change that were constructed by a really, really thoughtful scientist by the name of Mike Hume. One of the things, as we embark into this, so he wrote this very good book called Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And one of the things I find most frustrating about this topic is that we are stuck in this really elementary disagreement most of the time about whether or not it's already happened, if it's even happening. Whereas we talked about in week 1 and a bit of week 2, consensus has been achieved in the 1980s. The scientific underpinnings were discovered in the 1860s. There's so many more interesting things to disagree on. It's like we haven't even entered the conversation, and we can't even, there's this great ring where people from all sorts of political orientations and viewpoints and worldviews can duke it out, but people are just fighting outside in the waiting room and won't even enter this. So all sorts of fascinating disagreements, healthy ones that need to keep happening. One way to kind of, I think, give Mike Hume high praise is you can know you're a really effective climate scientist when radical right-wing groups do things like harass you, break into your office, hack your emails, and do everything under their power to discredit you. It's pretty incredible what scientists like Mike Hume have undergone. And one thing that's really kind of funny, if you go to his website, he's just so transparent about what he does. Like if he gave a talk to a community group and got a $50 honorarium, he publishes on his website. If he took the bus to a conference and got reimbursed it, he publishes that on his website. So we've kind of responded to this scrutiny by being even more transparent. Now, as we get going on this, I'd like to take a minute and quickly introduce my co-worker who happens to work with me during the week, Keely Kidner. So Keely is an eco-linguist, which basically means that she has expertise in language and the messaging and subtleties regarding the words that we choose related to the environment. So what we say, what we don't say, how we say it, and how that makes people respond. It's always incredibly handy to have an eco-linguist around. So really grateful that Keely has agreed to be on this call, or sorry, on this lecture. And after I go through the frames, I'm going to invite her to reflect and definitely critique what I say and how some of my words may have turned people toward or against responses. So without further ado, I'm going to go through the 6 types of responses that Mike Hume has constructed. And it goes without saying that these aren't mutually exclusive. You don't have to jump into one camp at the exclusion of all of the others. There's definitely ways that these can work together. But for now, we're going to look at them in each one at a time and really encourage you to think about how you react to them and which one really resonates with you. So the first frame is that climate change is a market problem. So it can be fundamentally addressed through market solutions. This really came into prominence with the Stern report, a UK economist in 2006. And Stern was one of the first people to articulate that the costs associated with inaction were higher than the costs associated with acting. So Stern was able to estimate that the overall cost of not acting by 2050 could be in the order of 5% of GDP, and this could rise to 20% of GDP by 2100. Another really good kind of market argument was the recent BC Ministry of the Environment report, which estimated that 1 meter of sea level rise would cost Metro Vancouver $9.5 billion. What's really interesting about this frame is it comes with ready-made solutions. So climate change is a market problem that is addressed through a market correction. And the two major types of solutions are a carbon tax and a cap and trade system. So basically, our market has failed in that we don't appropriately evaluate natural systems, and we have a commons in that people are allowed to pollute the atmosphere for free. With fairly simple corrections to the market, we can allow this problem to take care of itself in a sense. Okay, another frame, somewhat contrary to the market problem, is that climate change is fundamentally related to historical and structural inequalities, overconsumption, and unsustainable development pathways. So the rich and the powerful contribute to climate change disproportionately, much more than the others, and unfortunately share much less of the risks. So those arguing this statistic would this frame might note that the poorest 50% of the world's population produce 10% of emissions, while the richest 10% of people produce 50% of emissions. A resident of Canada emits somewhere in the order of 40 times as many greenhouse gases as a resident of Nepal. So wealth and power are key drivers of action for the global elite, and there is an inherent disregard for environmental damages. So the rich suffer, and probably a capitalist market system would only serve to perpetuate these inequities. And we probably couldn't solve this using a dominant Western technological framework. Another one is that climate change is a moral problem that fundamentally calls upon us to rethink ourselves and our relationship with the Earth. So in the short to medium term, many of the most vulnerable people are those who have emitted the least historically, and those whose emissions can continue to be relatively low are inordinately affected by climate change. This is unfair, and it casts a notable shadow over ourselves and over our worth. So it is a global phenomenon, and we need to look inward and really rethink our relationship to the world and each other at a moral level to solve this. Climate change is fundamentally a technical and knowledge-based problem. It is best addressed through research and technological solutions. So people who argue for this frame also have ready-made solutions on hand. So someone arguing this might note that in the last 20 years, solar power has come down by over 2 orders of magnitude. So it is less than 1/100th of the cost it was 30 years ago. That is a pretty, I think anyone would at least concede that that is a pretty impressive development. So what we need to do is rethink our energy system, rethink the way we go about our business, put money into research and technological innovation. Climate change is a long-term issue. It is here to stay. We need to learn how to live with a changing and changed climate. Those arguing this framework would probably point to the irreversibility of climate change. You might recall from week 2 when we talked about the IPCC latest report, someone asked a really good question of what new came out of the last assessment. And probably the biggest revelation is that climate change is much more irreversible than originally thought. So essentially, if we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we might be able to hold it, but we are very, very unlikely to go back. Same if we get to 2 or 3. A big part of that is the huge heat sink properties of oceans and their kind of long memory. So we're getting more energy right now from the sun. We're capturing more because of increased CO2 concentrations. So Earth's atmosphere is warming up. Earth's oceans, because they have such a high heat capacity, are warming up more slowly. But when we reach balance again, the oceans are going to respond. So we have to think about how we're going to live with this for generations, for hundreds and thousands of years. And this final frame, when Mike Hume put this out, this was kind of probably the least known frame, but it obviously has come to light, is that climate change poses real threats to our lives and the lives of our children. We must act immediately and decisively. So climate change is an urgent problem and it requires major interventions. We need to take immediate and direct measures to solve this crisis. We must take drastic action, maybe similar to what we did in wartime eras. So we have to fight this. This is something we have to overcome, and it is urgent. Okay, I'll give you a minute here. There, of course, is not there's not a correct answer or an incorrect answer to this, but I would encourage you to take a minute and reflect on the 6 framings of climate change and which one resonates most strongly with you. So which one do you feel like is the best framing of climate change that is going to elicit cooperation and action? Actually, I'll even let you define that, encourage you to define that how you feel like, but which one most strongly resonates with you? Okay, so it looks like inequity was the framing that was most, that elicited the highest response. And then also moral and emergency had significant response. Interesting. Okay, now just for interest, I would like you to think which framing of climate change do you believe would resonate most strongly with your parents' friends? Acknowledging that there's people among different generations here, but it'll be interesting to see if we get a different answer here. What do you think your parents would respond to most? Interesting. Okay, so it looks like technical is the strongest answer in this one. Yeah, and it's really fascinating. It's a little humbling to think about that at some point, probably sooner than I'd like to admit. It's going to be my kids thinking about how I'm going to respond to this and letting me know how my ideas may be antiquated. So it's certainly an interesting progression that we're all going through in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, it's worth thinking carefully about, what messaging, and it's not that we shouldn't use certain messaging at all, but it's just important to at least acknowledge that certain things, certain words, certain expressions, certain implications are not going to sit well with certain people. But again, maybe it certainly doesn't have to sit well with everyone. But thinking about your messaging and who you're talking about can be really important. So we're going to turn it over to Keely in a little bit, but before that, one last question. Oh, sorry, I'm still here. So if you had the opportunity, think of like a draft for a sports team, and you get to draft 2 of these frames that you'd like to put together to put forth a really strong and what you feel like is your best messaging about climate change. So you get to draft 2 of these 6 frames. Just curious to your thoughts of which of these you would best like to run with. So if we said next Wednesday, you're going to have to give a presentation where you argue why your framework is the best, and you get 2 of Hume's frames, which of these would you be most inclined to want to argue? So market and technical together, inequity and moral, emergency and moral, emergency and technical, long-term and technical, and finally market and inequity. I tried to make them a little bit complementary. Like I thought about doing long-term and emergency together, which probably doesn't work, but I thought it was kind of funny to just like have this we just have to keep people in a state of emergency for the next 50 years. Probably wouldn't work, but even though they seem opposed to each other, you're certainly able to take benefits of 2 that have definite discrepancies. Also encourage you to think about who you're watching. Which of these points people more towards adaptation, toward mitigation, and or toward geoengineering? So for example, emergency and technical might elicit responses that might be considered geoengineering by some, not by others. Okay, so it looks like B and D were the winners. So inequity and moral, and emergency and technical, and emergency and moral was close behind. And A, E, and F got significantly less votes. That's super interesting. So emergency and technical and inequity and moral. Those are very, very different to me, and they both got a lot of votes. Really, really fascinating. Okay, so at this point, I would like to hand it over to our ever handy eco-linguist, Keely, and invite her to reflect a little bit. Feel free to tear apart my language, some of the words I was using or not using, and given your expertise, what are some of the responses that may elicit, and how might people respond to them, or how might people react to these?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. This is very interesting, and as Ian mentioned, I am a super language geek, and I also am very concerned about climate change and environmental and social justice issues. So, ecolinguistics is a great marrying of all of those concerns. And I don't, I am not an exact expert in this very topic, but I do have a lot of expertise in how language is used and how power comes through language, and the words we use matter. So yeah, this is great. I will say what I'm going to talk about is based a lot on the work of Aaron Stibb, who's an ecolinguist based in the UK, and George Lakoff, who folks might recognize that name. He's done a lot of work on metaphor. And so basically, I just want to chat through a little bit about what framing is, and then some of the things that that we might want to think about when we're analyzing and thinking about a frame. So first of all, framing, to put it quite simply, is telling a story about how the world is and how thereby people should behave and relate to each other. And we actually do this all the time. It's one of the ways that humans understand the world. If we don't tell stories, we have a hard time understanding what's happening. And we do this without even realizing a lot of the time. If you think about the stories that are told by certain frames, there are often uh, uh, trigger words, what's known as trigger words, which tell us to apply a certain frame. So if we think about the frame of the economic or market frame, you might see words used such as cost, or even the term GDP. I think, Ian, at one time you said something about, the natural system as, externalizing and internalizing costs of the natural system. And so these kinds of terminology go into our brain and make us think, I know that story. I know what that word is about. And it takes this economic story and then pastes it onto the story of climate change. And so that's at the very basic level what's happening. We take a source frame and we apply it to a target frame. And a lot of times there are a lot of big emotions involved with this neural circuitry. These are things that have memories for us. These frames are things that we've grown up with or had experiences with in the past. And so they are not neutral in how we approach them. And the other thing I want to mention is that the more often a frame is repeated, the more normalized it will become, and it's easier then to activate without us even noticing. And these are the frames that we live by, or the stories that we live by. We don't think about them. And a great example is the metaphor of time is money. So we talk about time as if it is something that is valued like money. So we spend time, we save time, we do all these things around time that we waste time. So all these ideas of time being valued like money, and even the idea of time is money, as explicit as that, is something that we talk about all the time. So these are things that we don't always think about. And if we think about how things are repeated and then become normalized, this is obviously tied to power and who has control of the media messaging and the discourses that we use. And as you mentioned with that poll, it's really obvious that these frames, the dominant frames, change over time. So with certain generations, different frames may resonate more. And so that shows us that things are changing, language is changing, and that is one of the basic tenets of sociolinguistics, is that language changes over time. So there are a lot of different competing frames out there. Some of them work together and some don't necessarily, but there are always lots of frames changing all the time. And not only when you repeat a frame does it become easier to activate, but even negating that frame in a way you are repeating it, and that actually strengthens it. And a great example of this, I don't know if folks are familiar with Lakoff's book, Don't Think of an Elephant. The idea that as soon as you say don't think of an elephant, then people start to think of an elephant, and so you've activated that idea. And so repeating a frame by negating it even will help solidify it. But as I mentioned, frames and metaphors, if metaphors are a kind of a type of framing, are necessary to help us to comprehend these large, complex issues. And there's been a lot of research, psychological research, that shows that telling the facts by themselves doesn't necessarily help people take action or understand. And I'm sure a lot of scientists, physical scientists and climate scientists are nodding their head along, because yeah, you can tell people the facts until your face is blue, and doesn't mean that they'll really get it. And so what we've learned is that facts and information need to be framed in an accessible way in order for people to take it on. And so stories, by telling stories and helping people tell stories to themselves, this is one way that we can access that information. And one of the problems that we face when we come across communicating climate change is that it's not just an environmental issue. Climate change is a very complex mess of things that are coming together. There's structural issues, there's social issues, there's environmental issues, there's economic issues. And so this is a very big, difficult issue that we're dealing with. So I want to just quickly mention something about the values that frames might embody. And I see that the frames that you brought up, Ian, those 6 frames, kind of slot nicely into different sets of values. So basically, we can have basic intrinsic and extrinsic values. So intrinsic values are like altruistic values, so things that are coming from your own self, versus extrinsic values, where you place value on things that are outside of yourself, so that become a little more self-centered. So accessing money. So do you do something out of concern for others? Intrinsic, that might apply to a moral equity frame. Or do you take action because it will save you some money? And that is out of concern for yourself. And that is a more extrinsic frame. And that might be something like the market and economic framing. So you can see then in one of the little images that said it will cost us more money. So the reason that we want to take action is because of the money. Another thing that I noticed in the framing was one little word that I hadn't thought about until I started to think about climate change and metaphors for climate change. So one of the big metaphors that comes up with climate change is a problem. And problem is a very simple frame. You have a problem and then you have a solution. And once the solution is achieved, the problem goes away. However, climate change is not necessarily a problem. Climate change is a lot more complicated than that. And this is such a pervasive metaphor. It's become a metaphor that we live by, one that we don't even think about. And so when we think about climate change as a problem, we think, okay, we just need to find a solution and then it will be over and everything will be fine. But that also doesn't make room for adaptation and resilience. An alternative frame that I've seen to talk about climate change is the word predicament, which doesn't quite roll off your tongue in the same way, the climate change predicament. But the idea with predicament is it doesn't require a solution, it requires responses. And that is a little bit more, the argument is that word activates a frame that is a little bit more realistic to how we need to respond to climate change. Another frame that isn't mentioned in this, but gets talked about sometimes and peaks up a lot, is the climate change is apocalypse frame. And I know, Ian, this is one that we've talked about. And this frame doesn't allow for any solution or any response. The idea is that no matter what you do, everything is going to end very soon. And so that doesn't really allow for any action as well. So these are kinds of things to just watch out when you're reading and listening about climate change. What kind of trigger words make you think about certain things, and how do you feel? The climate change is apocalypse is not a good feeling frame. And one of the important things about thinking about metaphors and why it's important to consider what metaphors we're using is this idea as what's known as metaphorical reasoning. And the idea is that we come to conclusions about things based on the metaphors that we're using to talk about them. So a great example, which I don't know if it came up in any of these frames, but I did see a visual metaphor for it, is that climate change is a time bomb or a ticking bomb. And if we think about the story of this, there is definitely a sense of urgency to stop the bomb. but who is qualified to stop the bomb? Who is responsible for stopping the bomb? And if we think about the source story of diffusing bombs, we have really qualified, trained professionals who are responsible for diffusing bombs. And if we translate that over onto climate change, then there's certain actors, social actors that are meant to deal with this, that maybe not everyone is trained to deal with this issue. The other thing that comes across with that is that when we stop the bomb, when we defuse the bomb, the problem will go away. So it's a bit like a problem frame, but a little more specific. And we'll go back to living life as normal. The bomb has been diffused. And I've seen this been triggered by phrases and reports and things like that, talking about, you know, however many years we have left to reverse the course. And we have to think about the context in which this appears. So sometimes these triggers and this frame appears as a way to create urgency, which it definitely does. But we also need to understand that it implies that once we defuse the bomb, once we stop climate change, then the problem will be solved. And really, maybe that's not the best way to think about climate change. So I mentioned I saw this as a visual metaphor, and we communicate a lot through images. So I think in one of your slides, Ian, there was a little image of an Earth with a little bomb, and there we go. And that's a great example of a visual metaphor. So we look at that and we see the sense of urgency, and that, not even just talking about it, but just looking at that activates a sense of a story in our minds and tells us what needs to happen. There was also in the market one, if you go to the market slide, there's this great infographic with our factory that is producing emissions that are actually cash. And so if you think about the story that is activated by that frame, the economic frame. So in our culture, we believe that, you know, more cash is better. And so if cash equals emissions, then in this case, perhaps more emissions is better. And so there's this very subtle communication that's happening just by looking at that that infographic there. Yeah, so I think that I think I'll leave it there for now, but maybe later we can chat a bit about, if we have some time, global warming versus climate change and these different terms that we use. But I just want folks to think about, as we're looking at these frames, think about what kind of values they represent, what kind of stories they're telling, and who the social actors are and who's responsible for doing what. And I will, just to sort of sign off on this part, I will say that we are facing a predicament of climate change that is much bigger than and more complex of a system than folks have faced before. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of different frames and metaphors coming out. So Ian's chosen 6, but there are a lot more that are being used. And they all interact and work together. So this is one way that we're trying to make sense of the predicament before us, is by using as many ways to talk about it as possible. Just keep in mind whose frame, whose story gets told the most.
Thank you so much, Keely. That was really, really interesting and provocative. I think this might be a great point in time if anyone has questions specifically for Keely. This it might be a little bit of a natural break. So if anyone wants to chime in on the chat or request to be activated on their mic. Just as people are thinking, one group of recent people that have been, in my mind, masters of framing is the U.S. Republican group. Things like, it is so hard to argue against tax relief, or the death tax, or no child left behind. They're just absolute masters in the way that they present arguments, and how by arguing against them you reinforce them. Any questions? Okay, it looks like we'll carry on, and please do type a question, and I believe Keely can see those. Must admit, it is mildly terrifying to be talking, knowing with someone with your language expertise is listening to you, just like, oh. You said one word came to mind, and I was like, oh no, it was like or something, but at least it was.
I am a defender of
Good.
and like.
Great. Okay, so Just for a little bit of context, I've taught a fourth year class on climate change 5 times now at Quest University, and it's a really fascinating class. Always have just wonderful students who I throw through the ringer. And what we do in week 2 is I make them have a debate about these different frames, and they have to argue why their frame is the best. And the debate takes a whole class, and it's just fabulous every time. The different groups come up with these fantastic uses of language and argument to articulate why their frame should be the one that is first and foremost thought of. Of course, I mentioned it before, and I'm sure it became very evident to everyone who's listening, is the frames aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Using one frame doesn't negate another necessarily, and some of them do work together really well. So the assignment I give right after the debate is it's called Unite the Clans. And what I do is I give them one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and I ask them to draw out or map or graph or somehow digitally reconcile the frames and how they work together or don't. And I always get just absolutely fantastic answers. I'm just going to share a few of them. So this was a really, just a really thoughtful cartoon strip that a student gave that Kermit, the green frog, has all these adventures going through the 6 frames. And at the end in the bottom right, he reconciles them all and sees how they fit together. So I thought that was just a really clever communication example in itself. This student has designed a web of interrelations where she's put these lines, how they come together as a spider web, with moral as the spider and the other frames being flies that feed the spider. So it's come up with this pretty fantastic analogy of spinning this all together. Another student came up with an extended and very detailed umbrella analogy, showing how inequity is at the peak of it and how the other frames further help to support it, but inequity being the key piece. It's hard to see with this, but it has been color-coded very well, so it's very easy if you had a physical copy that you can see what's being referred to at different times. This student has done a really cool job of delineating how some of the frames are oriented to processes, some to reflection, and some to action, and how they build off each other. So ideas like market and technical as being more action-oriented and moral as being more programmatic. So starting in one of them and moving through other frames to get to actual boots on the ground and changes. This student has done a phenomenal use of taking advantage of the space and looking at how each of the framework how it plays out in terms of a number of different objectives. So how does each framework do in terms of responsibility, in terms of engagement, in terms of consumption, in terms of justice? And this student was able to use space and color really beautifully to articulate a lot of these ideas. I didn't show the whole one, but I just got such a kick out of the climate monster that one of my students created, and had different frames as being different ways that our hero was trying to vanquish this climate monster. But I just love the analogy of this like eyeless, hating, tree-eating glob. So Keely could probably point toward the analogy that this is showing. Very quickly, totally understand that there are more and probably better frames out there beside the ones that Mike Hume has put together. But 2 other competing frameworks that we can think about is whether or not it is fundamentally a local issue or fundamentally a global issue. So often people think that adaptation is more local in nature and mitigation is more global in nature. Do we need a top-down approach or do we need bottom-up approaches? I won't go into a lot of detail, but one thing I will say is that globally, municipalities, local governments, cities have blown the other orders of government out of the water. That's where almost all of the good news stories are. And globally, at these UNFCCC conferences, the COPs, et cetera, I've started to realize that in trying to make global agreements enabling local action has been kind of the framework we're using. And of course, local action can pressure global action as well. So pretty interesting interrelationships there. All right, we are going to spend the last few minutes talking about COVID. Oh no, I have a couple other I have one more. Okay, I'll ask you this just for fun. Maybe I'll skip the recap. But Bob Gifford is a psychologist at UVic, and him and Leela Scannell did a study, and they found some of these to be reliable and significant predictors of engagement with the topic of climate change. You can pick more than one, but which of these is a reliable and statistically significant predictor of climate change engagement? So place attachment, gender, having received a local specific message, having received a global message, or income level. Take a couple minutes and think about that, and I'll give you the response. So keep in mind, this is just one study. You might, other studies may contradict it, but it is a pretty exhaustive study. And they found that place attachment, gender, and having received a local specific message were significant predictors of climate change engagement. Income level was not found to have a correlation. However, they did acknowledge that they did this largely with university students, which might have skewed that. One thing that was very fascinating is having received a global message was not found to be better than having received no message. So significantly better to have received a local message, but it didn't actually matter if you'd received a global message or no message. So neither of those were found to be a predictor in engagement or a increase in engagement. So one that always jumps out at me, but is quite persistent in the literature, is gender. Women consistently report higher climate change engagement and environmental concern than men. So we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to leave these. We'll post them on the we'll post the PDF of the slides, but they're just a couple kind of lists of best practices related to communicating about climate change. A lot of them relate to what Keely was able to say very well. So I'll just leave them for your reference. The one on this one that I had to highlight because I got a chuckle out of it is face-to-face is better. Totally recognize the irony that I'm doing this in an almost empty room in front of a screen, but hey, these are the times. Telling stories, being specific, etc. Here's a IPC author handbook. So this was a handbook put forth to the authors of the chapters. One thing about being a confident communicator is trying not to get lost in the uncertainty. There's a lot about climate change that we don't know, but there is an awful lot that we do know, and not to get too lost in the weeds. And if you're not careful, you just come across as someone who's tripping over uncertainties all the time. And people who don't understand the scientific process in which you have to go to the cutting edge where no one knows and argue over that, people can lose that message that there is a large body of knowledge that we are very confident in. Okay, so this is going to be our last quiz question of the night as we get into COVID. So during the lockdown response phase to COVID, China's greenhouse gas emissions were estimated to have decreased by this percentage. So 25, 30, 33, 40, or 50. Okay. What was the winner? 33% was the audience winner. The answer is actually 25%, probably more than anything an example of me having framed the question trickily, because usually when there's a variety of percentages, one of the middle or higher ones is what you're supposed to pick, but it's actually 25%, which is still very, very significant. I'm going to skip over this next question because it's pretty ugly, the wording, and so I'll just share with you the result. Based on a pretty detailed global analysis of emissions, you can actually get about 75% of global emissions by looking at China, the EU carbon market, the Indian power sector, US emissions. And if you couple that with a couple other sources and then extrapolate that to the proportion of the global temperatures, they believe that greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 will be 8% lower than 2019. One thing that's really interesting is to hit our 2030 targets globally, they have to be about 7% lower per year. So we're probably going to hit our target for 2020 with COVID, but still not by a lot. So that just gives a little bit of context of the the magnitude of the challenge that we're looking at and how ambitious these targets are. This is just another slide to try to put into context what COVID has meant to our economy. So this is just showing the loss of employment related to other recent downturns. So very, very significant, and something certainly we all need to be very, very sensitive to. There's a lot of people undergoing a lot of acute stress right now. So, it's certainly not a point of time to just flippantly be like, oh, look at all these opportunities that we can gather from COVID. Because, and understandably, people want to go back to normal, want to go back to working and the way things were. So after something that's so unsettling like COVID, it just have to be very careful and very respectful about how you respond to this. So absolutely there are ways to do things better and lessons that we need to learn, but also recognizing and appreciating the situation a lot of people are in. So here are just some of the climate-friendly responses that a policy insight brief just released a couple days ago by the Community Energy Association in line with the BC Climate Leadership Council. So a couple of the things that are recommended, ways to respond to COVID and also to that are also climate-friendly. So shifting road space to distance active transportation, supporting working from home, supporting local farming, and public infrastructures related to EVs, resource recovery, renewable energy, etc. Just a quick shout out to Mayor and Council. They've really been driving the top one forward, trying to allow people to use public spaces for economic activity downtown, and also having the side effect of encouraging people to get out of their car. I do want to kick it back to Mayor Elliott because she is someone who's been thinking really deeply about this. So what I'm going to do is actually, let's leave the poll open. And if people would like to pick two of these that they feel like are major lessons learned, but as you're thinking about this, I'd like to give Karen Elliott some time to think what are some lessons that she feels are valuable to see carried forward from our experience with COVID. So these are just four that I've kind of picked out of a number of. So, as one of the lessons that we should continue forward, more remote working, more remote meeting, a greater focus on staying closer to where we live, and reduce consumption and consumerism. So yeah, I would like to hand it over to you, Mayor Elliott. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's been, a pretty crazy time since the middle of March. And I think we're still collecting the lessons learned, but speaking from a personal story, my spouse commutes to the University of British Columbia 4 days a week, and he hasn't done that since the middle of March. So in our home, we've regained the time, 3 hours of someone's time that he can put into home life or his own health or his community. And that's made a huge difference. And I think that's been replicated in many households. About 26% of our population commutes. So when I think about how sticky is the fact that people are now working more from home, many in district staff are, but also in our community. And is there an opportunity here to encourage businesses to really keep that trend going? As a local official, I spent a lot of time commuting to the city for meetings or going to conferences, and suddenly a lot of us as mayors are reflecting on the fact that we've been able to stay in our communities and still be connected to the meetings that we need to be in. And in fact, it's been easier. So I can tell you that I've had more contact with our MP and MLA and Vancouver Coastal Health through this pandemic than I've ever had, because no one needs to go anywhere. We just get to be at home and picking up the phone. And so the silver lining is that, and that applies to provincial ministers as well. I have biweekly calls with the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And last week she had the Premier join us, and we all got a few minutes to chat with the premier, which we tried to get a meeting with the premier to talk about transit. Couldn't do that. But I got a few minutes because we were on the phone last week. So I think there are things that we will want to preserve just in terms of how we manage our time. I think reflecting on our topic tonight around framing, and we have declared a climate emergency in Squamish. And I think that was important to create a sense of urgency and a sense of priority. But what was interesting to me when we entered the pandemic is that we were never, there was never a public health order, which is a law. When Bonnie Henry issues an order, that becomes law under a public health emergency. And she said, you can't have more than 50 people in a space. My recommendation is that you stay 2 meters away from each other. That was never an order, it was a recommendation. But the number of people in our community, and it was surprising to me, who were demanding that I enforce that recommendation, that I put police on the streets, that I put bylaw officers to work to police that action. And so when I think about the framing of an emergency, which is to move quickly, there's a dark side to that, which is to not do things democratically or with engagement or with or with the support of your population. And this is something I think a lot about when we talk about our community climate action plan, is that it's actually not okay for me to just push things through or to make this a more autocratic process because we've declared an emergency. We can't lead if no one's with us, if no one's following along with us. And so I think we do have to bring more frames into the conversation. This has been very disruptive to people's lives. And at the same time, I have seen people adapt very quickly. And our community has been very resilient and has shown a lot of care about their fellow citizens by respecting the recommendations that Dr. Henry put in place. I don't think we want to see the same sort of disruption as we grapple with climate change and the mitigation or adaptation that we put in place. But it does make me think about what is possible when people start working for the common good, and how do we frame that up? And so I think about, what is the conversation that we need to have in our community about what we learned from this experience, and how does it inform how we move forward as a community? So those are just some of my thoughts, Ian, but I'm happy if people have comments or questions.
Are there questions on the chat or no? Thank you so much, Karen. That was very well articulated. Yeah, and also, this is just a list essentially picked out of thin air of some of the lessons that could be carried forward, and there's of course many others. One thing I've certainly appreciated is that I feel like when people ask me how I'm doing of late, it just seems much more genuine, and that's something that I've really valued. That the idea of like asking someone and meaning it, how their health is and how their sanity is and how their things are going at home. I find there's a real richness in that, and that's something I really hope that goes forward. So we're just about out of time here, and yeah, so I think one thing I just want to clarify of these frames, so the 6 frames we went on, is that there are 6, and 8 years ago when Mike Hume put them together, they were kind of all on pretty even pedestals, but definitely the emergency frame has emerged, and with good reason. The emissions have increased, the science has gotten more stark. You don't have to make a conscious decision to adopt extreme language. The realities, the facts are themselves fairly unsettling, to say the least. So there are 6 important frames, but the emergency one has come into the light, and I certainly appreciate Greta Thunberg's some of her sentiments, like just kind of I'm not interested in your feelings. This is what it is, and I don't want you to pat me on the head and tell me I'm a champion. I want you to just do something. I find those very powerful. But certainly realizing that how other people react to those frames may be differently. One final time, I'd just like to thank Sandra and the rest of our communications team. It's been really fun to do these, and the only reason it has been fun is that there's someone sitting next to me who knows how to fix all of the problems I'm liable to come upon. So thank you very much to Sandra. Thank you very much to Karen Elliott for thoughtfully introducing each of these, and to a number of other counselors who have participated in them. And thank you all to all of you who have listened and who have participated in varying ways. It's been a lot of fun. I hope the next time we do something like this, it can be a little bit more conversational and in a little bit more personal format. As much as I love think that there's certain good things about COVID, I certainly miss getting together with people face to face in that community element. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. So yeah. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and I look forward to interacting with most of you, or all of you, or some of you in varying capacities in our community. Warm regrets.